Oh yeah, yeah. No, I have to get to them and make sure that they're okay. Okay. Aquí estamos.
Recording. Ay, me voy a quitar esto. USDA maybe. Computer. Y no funciona acá. Let's continue.
Okay, you don't worry for also.
Yeah.
The other computer? Yeah, so you want me to connect it?
We're trying to get her screen on the projector.
Okay, so do you want me to connect it over there?
Oh, it's not connected? It is. It is.
Oh, yeah?
Trata, pongámoslo en el tuyo mejor.
Oh, it's like a...
I think it's for the projector. It's the projector. I'm trying all the different possibilities. Yo lo puedo ver aquí, pero quiero que la gente lo vea. Lo ponemos en el de casa.
Si no funciona,
Hello, everyone. Oh, is that too loud? I think I'm gonna get started very soon. I'm just going to get my slides up there so yeah, you can follow along with me. So I think it's the same yesterday, same. Where do you have your flash drive? It's kind of
any flash drive might go flash drive. You know what I mean?
You just open up the flash name. And then you just drag it in there. And then pull it out. And if you don't mind doing that to save it, take it out. I don't know, I have my I'll just take it out. I have my wedding. Oh, no. But it should be fine. CNLD conference 2018. Yes. I'm gonna leave my flash drive. And your notes are there. Hello, everybody. Now we can get started. Sorry about the technological difficulties and the delay. My name is Sara M, and I am part of the CNLD's leadership. I have been leading and was a founder of the Neurodiversity and Organizational Strategy Committee for the CNLD. This is a very personal project because I am neurodivergent. I am autistic in particular, and I'm going to talk to you about sort of the paradigm shift that neurodiversity entails and what that means for the Latinx movement. So the subtitle of the presentation is Centering the Voices of Neurodivergent Change Agents, and this is very important in the sense that there's always been this idea that people with developmental disabilities, autistic and otherwise, their experiences need to be mediated by professionals, by parents, by friends, by, and that idea doesn't really relate to the idea of interdependence as much as it does to the idea of independence in terms of productivity and being socially accepted citizens within, I guess, our current social, economic, political, and cultural structure. So I want to know if you are familiar with the term interdependence, first of all. You are familiar? So, what's your idea of it? We all need each other, and it can be washed out in terms of like, oh, we need each other, sort of like humanist view or kumbaya kind of idea. But if we talk about it in terms of disability, it is a pretty political statement in terms of how we have pushed this ideology of independence upon disabled people. And you'll also notice that I'm using identity first language. Do you know the differences between identity first language and person first language? People familiar with that? No? Maria Luisa, you're not familiar? So, and one thing that I forgot to say is that I have the slides up here. They're not exactly what I'm gonna say. They're a little bit of a guide for you and a little bit of a sort of like a guide for me as well, but I'm not gonna repeat exactly what's in the slides. My brain doesn't work linearly like that. So I work with this so that I can interact with you and sort of like think about ideas, but I'm not gonna follow that exactly. So you might like keep that in mind. So with the inception of the disability rights movement in the United States in the late 60s, there was this need and this collective desire of reclaiming disabled people's humanity, first of all, because we were not considered to be necessarily up to pair with other non-disabled human beings, right? So hence our treatment, and I'm talking about our and us in collectivity, thinking about various disability communities. But think about the histories of our ancestors and of those who came before us and who were brutalized in institutions, for instance, right? And who were subjected to inhumane practices, confinement, and all kinds of triggering things that I don't think I need to rehash right now. So the reclaiming humanity was a very important part of the disability rights movement. And the activists and the self-advocates who were working toward those goals were very invested in really creating a language through which to talk, to state about these things, right? We are people first. So the distinction between person first and identity first is one of a gradual transformation of a movement, right? Movements are gradually transformed and they have various stages and various phases. So the disability rights movement is like a first stage in our fight for recognition, right? And quote unquote, yes, inclusion as we understand, the majority of people understand inclusion within our society. So person first language was very important for those first sort of decades of the movement. And when we were reclaiming our humanity sort of in opposition to the medical model of disability, which considers disability as an individual problem, quote unquote deficit, quote unquote lack, right? And that is sort of measured and gate kept by medical professionals. that gradually transitions into what's known today as the social model of disability, which actually looks at the social structures, the interpersonal relationships, attitudes, value systems, ideologies that are disabling and that produce disablement. So disabling societies create disability for different people with different forms of embodiment, or who are embodied in multiple ways. And so a first important part of that was the autistic movement of the United States in the 90s, reclaiming the social model of disability and thinking about identity first language. I am an autistic person versus I am a person with autism, trying to center the processes by which neurological and different cognitive styles are stigmatized and disabled in society, and to claim that autism is not something that we have and carry around with us in a bag, or we put it on as a hat and take it off at our convenience. Autism is who we are. It is part of our identity. It is not solely a diagnostic label. It is actually a culture, right? So autism is a valuable and valid and celebrated way of being in the world. So these two sort of distinctions, so identity first language is very, it is actually the preferred form to use for the very autistic, like many autistic communities around the world, actually. And this comes from self-advocates who are ourselves autistic, and we're mostly adults, right? Because you think about, there's so much talk around autistic children. And I feel like our conversations among self-advocates is, where do people think disabled children go? Autistic or disabled children go? They grow up, right? They grow up and we become adults. And so we are here and we have a lot of things to say and a lot of things to communicate. But because there is a very specific way in which society understands communication, right? And what legitimate ways of communicating are, which is with a very strong emphasis on verbal and literacy skills, right? Society and sort of the medical webbings of that consider many non-speaking autistics, for instance, as people who do not communicate and have nothing to say. So identity first is very important for us. So you'll hear me use identity first language throughout versus person first. And our communities, various disability communities, are rich, layered, fragmented. We all have different views and we don't share in everything, as it is the stereotype. So a lot of people use person first, and that is perfectly valuable and perfectly respectable. I wanted to give you a brief historical overview, which I gave you a little bit in terms of the disability rights movement and sort of its evolution, right? Its gradual transformation. And I will talk to you a little bit about disability justice, sort of the gradual movement toward disability justice from disability rights. It's not the same thing. And it is at that intersection, or that at the sort of interstices of those two sort of perspectives of the disability communities that the Latinx movement appears, right? Disability justice is disability at the intersections of multiple lived experiences and identities. So disability at the intersections of class, race, gender expression, ethnicity, sexual orientation, citizenship, status, religious practice, and so on. Okay. So a lot of my work is based on this sort of transition from the centering of industrial societies and the way that industrial societies create value systems around productivity, and how how our beliefs about productivity, especially in Anglo-American and Western societies, are on how much can a body produce? And according to how much a body can produce, right, then that body would acquire a certain value worth, socially, humanly, politically, culturally, right? So it sort of depends on this economic system that then translates into other layers of societal structures. And so according to this industrial sort of quote unquote rationality, the most important values are rationality, independence, and productivity. And these are, of course, very arbitrary in the sense that they are described, that they are conceptualized, that they are represented. But what they do have in common is that they almost invariably exclude disabled people. Rationality, right, is not something that we are associated with, and especially thinking about sort of the hierarchies of disability. So if we think about, for instance, people with cognitive, mental, and developmental disabilities, you'll see that there is a differentiation between how much we can grasp, quote unquote, intellectually and cognitively, and what that means for a rational, quote unquote, productivity. You know, so I'm thinking about the capitalist system and what that means in terms of our human worth. So because of this sort of big transition from like rural societies to industrial, very high-paced societies, and this emphasis on productivity and independence, a worker must be independent in order to produce at a certain rate that will then allow for that profit and surplus value to reproduce, right? Our bodies were sort of started to being assimilated to the machines in the assembly line in the factories, right? And the bodies who did not assimilate the pace, the rhythm, sort of these anatomical structure and the cognitive, quote unquote, capacity to assimilate to the machine would be ejected from the labor force, right? So if we think about the rates of unemployment of disabled people throughout all of these decades, if we begin with the landmark of the 1960s, right, although it goes way back, and up to today, you'll look at what rates of unemployment we have among disabled people, not only in the United States, but globally, right? So as I mentioned before, the disability, why is it not moving? Oh, because I'm moving mine, I'm not moving that one. Oh, I'm so sorry. So this is what I was talking about before, I'm so sorry. Were you able to follow me, what I was saying? Oh, okay, good, okay. So this is what I was talking about in terms of independence, rationality, and productivity, capitalism, industrial societies, so on and so forth. Then I told you a little bit about the disability rights movement, but I want to talk about this sort of the inception of disability rights, not only in terms of like thinking about our rights as human beings, but also within civil society. You know, so what does that mean to have civil rights? What does it mean to have equal access to transportation, employment, education, healthcare, child rearing, so on and so forth? So this was the first really a real emphasis on those fights were civil rights, right? But disability is much more than access in terms of transportation, employment, education, healthcare, right? There is a disability culture, and we organize around that culture as well. So I told you a little bit about disability. Ooh, what's going on? Where did Catalina go? Oh, you're here. Disability hierarchies. Okay. So disability hierarchies, what I was mentioning before in terms of like divisionism, or like dividing ourselves in terms of like, oh, I am physically disabled. This is an example. I'm physically disabled, but I'm very smart. This is, do you know what I mean? This is something that's being inculcated into this. We're being indoctrinated to separate ourselves so that we can fight amongst each other for the very little resources that are allocated to us. And that creates what? Fragmentation between us. So there is this fight for occupying the status within society. So physically disabled people will separate themselves from people, thank you, from people who with cognitive, mental, and developmental disabilities, right? And that will create tension, and that will create friction, and that's actually part of who we are as a movement and the conversations that we must have, right? So part of this is really highlighting the experiences of a self-advocacy and activism spearheaded by physically disabled people, right? Mostly men, mostly white, mostly middle class, right? And this is disability rates. This is like the base structure of this. Why? Because this is the kind of access that society had allowed and has allowed for disabled people. It's like, you are disabled, okay, but you need to be middle class at least. Or you're disabled, well, at least you need to be a man or male identified. Well, you're disabled, well, you need to be white, because otherwise this is like too much. And then Dolores before was talking about, like, they didn't know how to, like, where to begin to discriminate me because of the many intersections of my identity, right? So this has caused that a lot of the materials that have been indeed produced by people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, amongst them autistic people and otherwise neurodivergent people, have been sidelined and sidestepped. Why? One of the reasons is that those materials are not literacy based, meaning they're not documented in the same ways that other disabled people have documented their movements. Does that make sense? It is more of a gathering of forces that aligns with a more interpersonal sort of interaction and communication that in many ways wasn't documented word by word, right? These things have changed throughout time, but when these movements started like sort of like sprouting, the emphasis was not documenting it in writing. It was getting together and gathering along their experiences. So yeah, so other aspects of this have been sort of the differences between the rates the rates of forceful institutionalization, incarceration, isolation between physically disabled people or people with sensory impairments and other disabilities, right? Other disabilities that have been conceptualized as dangerous, criminal, right? And associated with that is, of course, ethnicity and race. And, of course, autism and other forms of neurodivergence. I mean, if you follow the news, or if you're like sort of in touch with the stuff that's going on around, and trigger warning for this, mass shootings in schools, like in high schools, and what's the first thing that people say, if I can ask the audience?
Mental illness.
Mental illness. Or this person was a lone wolf referring to autism without really saying it. And what gets overlooked there is whiteness and toxic masculinity. So disability immediately becomes a scapegoat. It's always like, oh, we need better healthcare. It's not we need gun reform. It's we need better healthcare, or we need to really tame these people, or we really need institutions. We can't give these people their sort of agency and autonomy. And so in this fight, a lot of activists like Tia Nellis, who is the director of SABE, which is Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered, which is the biggest coalition, national coalition, and the first for self-advocates for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And so what they claim is very, very to the point and simple. It is their mission has been to, since the 1990s, has been to support people with intellectual and developmental disabilities in speaking out for themselves on issues that impact their lives, to ensure that they are treated as equals and that they are giving the same decisions, choices, rights responsibilities, and chances to empower themselves, opportunities to make new friends, and to learn from their mistakes. So with this idea, with Save's mission statement and their visions and what they outline for themselves as self-advocates, empowered self-advocates, is we have invariably, like our experiences have been invariably mediated by others. We are shielded, we are patronized, we are compared to children in terms of like quote unquote mental age. We are not allowed to make our own decisions for fear of risk and failing. Do not all human beings risk things and fail at things? Yeah, am I seeing some nodding around? Yeah, why are people with cognitive, intellectual, and mental disabilities not allowed to fail and risk and make their own decisions? There are many factors involved here, and it's very complex to place blame on any one side. I will say that on the one hand, there is immense love from on the side of parents, of course, and fear, because parents see how society responds to their children's embodied expression, right? So parents observe the kind of discrimination and the kind of stigma that is visited upon their children. So of course they want to shield their children like any other parent. Well, not any other parent, I don't want to generalize. Most parents want to do for their children, disabled or not. Parents don't want their children to suffer, right? And so it's not that parents believe that their child is inherently quote unquote deficient or lacking. It's that they observe the interactions between society and their children's embodiment and expression, and they're first fearful of this, right? So this sort of like infantilization and patronizing attitudes and like overly protective attitudes and decisions are justified. They have a reason for being. So instead of really focusing on individual blame and on looking at what parents are doing wrong and they're not listening to self-advocates, they're listening to professionals, and they're not, it's like, really, why don't we shift our attention to the social structures that are actually producing these beliefs about disability that then become materialized in practice, right, through policy? But just look at institutionalization, for instance, or community-based services that I call care. Community-based care still is organized around this idea that disabled people, and especially neurodivergent and autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people with intellectual and mental disabilities, cannot make decisions for themselves, that they will make the wrong decision. So there's never really the opportunity to be exposed to decision making in the world, right? And then people are surprised that we are not quote unquote independent. What does that mean? Independent to what? To produce for the world system, or more so independent and happy? What does happiness mean? Does happiness mean producing, or living a wholesome experience? And a wholesome experience has nothing to do with the labels that are allocated onto our bodies. It is how we define ourselves and are allowed to live a life that we want to lead, right? And this is not the opportunities that the most autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people have, as well as people with intellectual disabilities and mental disabilities, right? So, and on the other hand, so this relationship with parents and their fear of their children being violated, because it's very real, is of course justified, right? And so what happens is also that the side of the professionals, and I'm not saying, this is not me claiming all professionals have ill intentions. I'm not saying that at all. I am saying that a lot of professionals also in the same sort of like similar situation to parents, or our parents themselves, understand that the people that they serve are discriminated against. They see that their experiences aren't equal. So they do want to help, right? But in doing so, most of them follow very outdated guidelines and books and things that do not represent personal lived experience, and that's what they base their desire to help on, right? So there is this sort of communication that exists between parents and professionals that have the best intentions. I'm not saying everybody has the best intentions, but I want to believe that people want to help. You know, that people want to be involved with of course, with their children or their family members, and that professionals actually get into professions because they want to make a better world. I don't know. These communications often, if not invariably, exclude the person who with the lived experience, right? So the books are not based on someone interviewing or having a conversation with an autistic or otherwise neurodivergent person, or intellectual disability or mental disability. It's based on a book. The book is written by people who do not experience disability and who study a lot and find tons of research. Does it mean that research is always accurate? Does it mean that science is invariably objective? Like, let's think about that, right? And so a lot of what the autistic US and otherwise, I'm focusing on the historical and geographical sort of like context of the United States, is like, what are autistic self-advocates, adults, arguing for? It's like, talk to us. Do you want to learn about our experience? Communicate with us. We have a lot to contribute to this movement, and we have. So a lot of the initiatives that are being spearheaded by autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people are super important. You know, it's like, you know how the congressmen or the men in the government get together to legislate on women's bodies without women? They get to say what our uteri do or what it doesn't do, right? You see these meetings with all these men, like these memes circulate around. It's like 50 men, and it says this men are legislating about women's rights without women. Isn't it the same thing? Talking about autism and otherwise neurodivergent experiences and producing an idea of this or what it is without autistic people. Why are our voices and our experiences not included in this conversation, right? And so in that spirit, the CNLD has a very specific mission and understanding of these experiences. And of course, these experiences become further erased at the lines, at the intersections of race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexual orientation, citizenship, and so on, right? So our mission is to, because even within the neurodiversity movement, which is a paradigm shift, right, from the medical model of disability onto centering neurodiversity as an integral part of the human experience, not as a disorder or disease that needs to be cured or I don't know, prostheticized or tamed or ABA'd, right? It is an experience that is part of this world that we want to pathologize because it's different from everything else, right? And so this paradigm shift, and it's also a social justice movement, right? It is a movement for, I don't know why this is movement on its own, I'm so sorry. So this paradigm shift is like trying to say, acknowledge our experiences, but not because we want to be quote unquote included into the non-disabled world, but because we have a lot of things that we have to contribute to making sort of the world anew, right? Like an in-between space where we can have conversations and where we can have conversations and create a new view of our experiences, your experiences, the experiences of parents, the experiences of professionals in collectivity, right? There is a power dynamics that is rarely acknowledged between professionals, parents, and disabled people in general. Yeah. And this, of course, happens more so when disabled people don't have access to spoken language, like I mentioned before. So there's this conflation between other forms of communication and incapability, right? We place this emphasis on speech. Other people who don't have access to speech have a lot to communicate and say. So instead of thinking about our ways of communicating and responding to our environment as problems, you know, as things that should be changed because they don't assimilate to the norm, trying to mediate how those forms of communication actually add to the richness of the human experience is one of our goals. So this is, I don't know if you've seen this hashtag going around, disability to white. So this sort of speaks to the many victories and the many amendments and policies and stipulations and legal reforms that sort of were spearheaded by the disability rights movement. But the struggle for recognition along these markers of identity, of intersecting experience continues. You know, we have not been, and when I say we, I mean Latinxes with disabilities or disabled Latinxes, our experiences have not enjoyed the same visibility within disability rights movement as have other experiences, mostly experiences of the majority, right? So this is the transition to disability justice. And disability justice is being defined first by a group of artists. You remember Maria Palacios was here yesterday? She's part of Sense and Valid, which is a collective of performers, a troupe of artists of color that center gender non-binary experiences. And they focus on sensuality and sexuality and bring it on stage. It's like kind of in your face, our bodies are not, we're not infants. Sexual desire and sexual experiences are actually part of our lived experience. We are human beings. There has been this sort of like metaphorical castration or ablation, mutilation, right, by the medical establishment of our bodies as sexual and desiring, right? So Sense and Valid brings this perspectives in your face. And they're the first creators of the notion of disability justice. And they say, and this is a description by the definition by the Autistic Women's Network, a model of disability that is concerned with intersections, interdependence, embracing and celebrating disability and diversity, questioning privilege, ableism, and seeking to dismantle systems of oppression. So one oppression doesn't work on its own. Oppression needs other forms of oppression to reproduce and become multiple, right? And there's a showing up for racial justice kit online. I don't have it in the slides. It talks about ableism as a tool of white supremacy. Because if we're thinking about bodies and different embodiment and difference in terms of like so many things like carnal experiences, how can disability and disabled bodies be extricated from that? Doesn't difference really become with disability? Like, isn't disability a difference, an embodied expression that actually covers all other identities? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, disability transverses lived experience across identities. So here are 3 of the 10 principles of disability justice by Patty Byrne, who's the director of Sense and Valid, and her collaborators. The first one is, each person has multiple identities related to race, culture, language, gender, class, sexual orientation, gender identity, ability, age, and more. 2, disability shapes social/political interactions, but not in isolation. 3, disability justice acknowledges that the fulcrum of attitudes and justice can shift depending upon the characteristics of the parties who are interacting. Race, gender, class, race, class, gender expression, age shape how a disability is experienced and viewed. And you can find this, all the 10 principles in this link that I give below. I think you may have access to this PowerPoint somehow, and if not, you can have access if you ask me for it. So here we have 3 different images, and the 3, like the 2 on the right are created by an artist called Micah Bazin, who is based in the Bay Area. And Micah also performs with Sense of Valid and collaborates with them in many other ways. So the first top right reads, "Justice for Mario Woods. Over 50% of people killed by police are disabled. Disability justice now. Black disabled lives matter." And this is an image of a Black man wearing a black beanie. He has some facial hair. I think it's a goatee, maybe that's called a goatee, something like that. And he's wearing a black sweatshirt, and you can see like a white, maybe he's wearing a white t-shirt underneath. And the one below that reads, "Disability justice. To exist is to resist." And this was creating during the bombings of Gaza 2 years ago. And you can see that there is a Black woman wheelchair user who seems to be imprisoned. She's wearing an orange, what's it called? A jumpsuit. And then she's or they are, I don't know, they're extending their hand and they're reaching out for a woman who's sitting down and leaning against a wall and is wearing all white, and it seems to be a woman who has been wounded in Gaza. So there is like this split, and you can see where the wall where this other woman is leaning against. You can see sort of like airstrikes, like bombs and sort of like explosions. And so it's like the intersection between global disability issues, right? So whatever is happening in the United States around Black disabled women who are incarcerated and women in Palestine. Does that make sense? Okay, I'm trying my best to do image descriptions. Then on the left, we have this following text is a poster. It says, "All bodies are caught in the bindings of ability, race, class, gender, sexuality, and citizenship. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our identities, but because of them. Only universal collective access can lead to universal collective liberation. This is disability justice." And you see here, one of the performers with Sense and Valid. It is a Black woman who's extending their hands out into the audience, and they're wearing like a scarf. Oh, I don't know what this is. Maybe they're wearing a dress and a big necklace, and also like something over, like a shawl with different forms and shapes. Okay. So what are the stakes for us, for the CNLD and the kind of work that we're doing? So I already mentioned before that the social and cultural experiences, as well as the political activism of disabled Latinxes, have not enjoyed the same visibility within larger disability rights movements, right? So what's important about this is that we need to become familiar with our own stories. And how do we do that? We do that in collectivity and gathering together and discussing, right? And so sort of one of the main projects of like the current economic and ideological liberal state is to divide us. You know, like instead of like exerting this like super hyper visible violence, which is also happens, is sort of like extend some sort of tentacles and try to divide us from within. So what we need to do is actually the opposite. It's come together and try to fight those divisions that are coming externally. So we say that it's especially important to understand that the lived experiences of Latinxes with cognitive, mental, and developmental disabilities, including autism and other forms of neurodivergence, have been traditionally subject to erasure and relegated to the peripheries of our collective movements for liberation. Then, of course, I was talking about institutionalization and seclusion. So this invisibility has been tied to the trajectories of institutionalization and isolation. And again, the targets of those violences have been people whose experiences are deemed unintelligible, quote unquote, because they're not communicated in the normative ways or the ways that we expect all human beings should communicate, and then are deemed unimportant because of that. So here's fulfilling our vision. So the primary mission and goal of the CNLD, I write, in this aspect is to bring attention to and actively incorporate the multiple experiences of the Latinx diaspora into the fold of disability justice activism, locally, nationally, and transnationally. Like, this movement is not only local, we're trying to reach out to the Latinxes around the world who are experiencing similar life circumstances. So our role for us is to account for intersecting forms of oppression touching on the lives of Latinxes with cognitive, mental, and developmental disabilities, and to carve intentional spaces for the voices and activism of these groups to flourish alongside other politicized disability constituencies. And so these are part of the committee proposal that I wrote 2 years ago for the Neurodiversity and Organizational Leadership Committee. And so I write, as disability activism gains visibility and momentum among Latinx communities, we are in a better position to make a difference in terms of how we connect and engage with different leaders and advocates across the country and beyond. So as Latinx disability collectives join in larger conversations for social justice and become collective responders to the oppressions that have kept us isolated and disempowered, it is our responsibility to reach out and to build alliances across various disability constituencies and to incorporate and center their voices, our voices, in the fold of our movement. So following on that vision for us, it's been crucial to engage with the variety of lived experiences and embodied lived and embodied experiences of autistic and otherwise neurodivergent Latinxes in the United States and beyond. And the impact of this is that the wider recognition of these initiatives is necessary and incumbent to the further development of cross-national as well as international advocacy coalitions working toward the building of new ways of living and understanding disability beyond medical models, both as a category of difference and as a cultural and political experience shared by millions of disabled people across the board. So I have a little summary for you. The first point is ongoing isolation and segregation continues to be the most common experience for disabled people. This is especially the case for people living at the intersections of race, class, gender expression, sexual orientation, ethnicity, and citizenship. 2, leadership in collective movements for liberation are already happening and being spearheaded by people with developmental, intellectual, and mental disabilities, including autistic and otherwise neurodivergent people. And 3, breaking this cycle of isolation and neglect of these communities within the framework of disability rights activism is imperative. And these are the action strategies that we have been implementing. The first one is the experiences, voices, and leadership of and neurodivergent Latinxes must be encouraged and incorporated into the fold of our movement, the CNLD especially. The creation of a caucus aimed at bringing neurodivergent Latinxes into positions of leadership was necessary. The caucus addresses educational strategies, information, and encourage collective meaning making. And the last one is the caucus center peer leadership training and collaborative writing. And for more information, here are my details. You can contact me. And you can find my, the committee that I lead in my page with the CNLD. Thank you, everybody. If you have any questions or comments, I welcome them all. Un minuto.
Can I just talk here?
I don't know if that, do we have another microphone? Hi.
Hi.
What's your name?
I'm Sandra Breitengross-Bitter, and I'm with the Texas Silk.
Okay.
And thank you very much for your perspective today. And I just wanted to hear a little bit about, I think you started to touch on it and I might have missed it, but the differences between interdependence from your perspective and independence.
Yeah.
For the work that we're doing, we see independence in the sense of making sure that an individual can live, play, and work in the community of their choice and take as much risk as they want.
Definitely.
So I kind of wanted to see how those two terms coincide for you.
Totally. So the definition of independence that we bring, such as the one that you brought within our communities, is very different than the notion of independence that's imposed onto us according to that system of productivity. So I think that in my research and in the work that I do with my students, what I try to talk about is bodily autonomy versus independence, to sort of do like upturn there, or like to turn the tables, and then bring in interdependence as a form of like coalition building and collaborative experiences. You know, like all the people that we have been all the people that we've been hosting these days have been talking, like the women before, the Wheeling Magnolias, amazing. They were talking about being their own heroes with each other. And that's an experience that we have as leaders of CNLD. It's like, we build each other every day, not only through our work, but our personal experiences of disability and intersecting forms of oppression that we have in our lives. And another person yesterday was also talking about her relationship with her daughter is one of interdependence. Not like my daughter sacrifices her life so that I can live mine as a disabled person. It's like, no, we build each other, you know? And that's very common within like collectivist societies. And interdependence is just a way of being human that's sort of taken away from us because of the not only current, but this has been going on for a long time, but the forms that really emphasize on this like sort of heightened individuation and pull yourself by your bootstraps and the American dream. If you need help, you are weak and you have failed. So I make the distinction between independence and bodily autonomy and interdependence. Thank you, Sandra. Anybody? One more, Luisa.
Okay.
Vente pa acá.
You gave a very shocking statistic about 50% of the individuals that are collectively disabled.
Yes.
You also mentioned the problem with institutionalization and incarceration in the United States.
Yes.
What is your organization, or who is doing something to work on this huge problem that we have as a society?
Oh, our coalition is doing a lot around immigration and detention centers. The Immigration Committee, Catalina Galvan, is the leader. She's not here. The coalition is doing, you know about the activity we were doing yesterday? So this is engaging with the people in the government. I'm sorry, I don't know the names of the government people, congressmen, the representatives, and those people. I don't understand party politics. So, but yeah, we are doing a lot in terms of advancing our conversations with like officials, right? And at the community level, we'll be building, we're having Maria Mario Noe. Hola, Mario. And the experiences. So Mario's gonna, I think, talk about this and sort of like what kinds of coalition building we're building around these issues. And disability justice is very tied to this survey. This was created by Citizen Valid, that piece that I read, the 50%, and there's a special project on police brutality against disabled people of color, led by Leroy Moore. And there's a new documentary out called Where's the Hope? And it's all filmed in San Francisco and Oakland, and of instances of police brutality against disabled people every day with real footage. Okay. Ya me cortaron, me tengo que ir. Thank you. That's okay. Perfecto. Okay, gracias.
Okay. We are going to have a working lunch, but I'll give everyone 10 minutes to sort of grab their lunches, talk a little, stretch, and then we're going to start with their next presentation.
She's going to interpret. I think he's going to sign. Yeah. She's going to interpret for him, and then maybe someone can interpret to English. I think, unless we don't need it. But you're leaving, is what you're trying to tell me? No, I'm going to be here. No, he's not doing it right now, later in the day. What time are you leaving at? Like 5? Oh, yeah, you can do it. Will you do it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna ask first if anybody needs it, but if they do, then I will do it. They just did it yesterday. Yesterday we had a session in Spanish, and I came up and I asked, like, does anybody need it?
Sí, entiendo. So he's gonna stand here, he's gonna sign, she's gonna translate for him in Spanish, and then you're gonna interpret for people who don't speak Spanish in the audience.
Yes, if those exist.
I'm gonna piss off the sign language folks again.
What?
We're gonna piss off the sign language folks again. It's fine.
Why are we pissing?
Oh wait, let me stop recording this.